Hey, I'm Eric Vanman. I'm an associate professor in psychology at the University of Queensland in Australia. And I periodically give these little updates about the books that I've been reading. I haven't given one for a few months now, and this year I'm trying to read 50 books, and that means I have to read about one book per week. I haven't been keeping up very well. The semester just finished at the University of Queensland, and I've got a few weeks before semester 2 begins, so maybe I'll catch up then. But I have 12 books to talk about right now. Now, if you've watched any of my other videos, you'll know that I have a very eclectic taste in books. I read everything, nonfiction, fiction. In the nonfiction domain, I like to read a lot of biographies, memoirs. I also like to read books about psychology, obviously. In the fiction realm, I'll read quite literary fiction, classics, but a lot of contemporary books as well. And so you'll see that this is a pretty good sample of the smattering of weird things that I like to read. So let's go ahead and get into that, and I'll talk about my 12 books right now. Now, the first book on my list is The Talented Mr. Ripley by Patricia Highsmith that was written in the late 1950s. The reason why I read The Talented Mr. Ripley is that one of my favorite authors right now, Donna Tartt, who wrote The Secret History, I saw her in an interview talk about the fact that she really liked this novel. And she said, despite what you might have seen in the movie, this book is really good. And I found that intriguing because I did actually see the movie when it came out with Jude Law, Matt Damon, Gwyneth Paltrow, like 20 years ago. And I, at that time, wasn't that impressed with the movie. It was really pretty, but I didn't like the story. So I thought, well, I'll give it a shot. Maybe the book is a lot better. And I am glad that I read it. It turns out that Patricia Highsmith wrote several of these books about Mr. Ripley. There was sort of like a series of books going on through the 1960s. So maybe I'll read those as well. But this is the first novel in this series, and you'll see that Mr. Ripley basically has to get out of his predicaments, otherwise there couldn't have been those later books. But it's basically sort of a story of catfishing, really. It's a guy who takes on someone else's identity and fools all of his friends and family of the guy whose identity they stole. And the reason why he's able to steal the guy's identity is because he murders him. Yes, so it has a murder component to it. And while the police are desperately trying to figure out what's happened to the original friend that's disappeared here, Mr. Ripley, this talented Mr. Ripley character, he's able to take on his friend's identity and write checks and change his appearance enough so that people think they've seen the guy that's disappeared, and is able to evade the authorities while he's staying in Italy for several months and years. So it's really interesting about deception, about identity, how people are easily fooled by things like this. I don't know if you could pull the same thing off today, but maybe, like I said, he'd be like a catfishing kind of person. And given my interest in catfishing, maybe that Mr. Ripley would be a good one to go for. The second book on my list is The Very Secret Society of Irregular Witches by Sangu Mandana. Now, this book was something that I had seen recommended in a video about magic, and I was a fan of the Harry Potter books, and so I guess I have to say that I was intrigued by what this book sounded like, and wow, it's sort of an adult version of Harry Potter. There are kids in this, and kids who perform magic, but the main characters are also witches, and it's really kind of told from the perspective of a 30-year-old woman who is single and is dating and has sexual relations with other characters and swears a lot. And so I thought it was sort of interesting that I wonder if any kid would have picked up this book in a bookstore and thought, oh, this looks like a Harry Potter kind of book, and then starts to read it and discovers it's quite adult. I think it's probably really aimed at people who grew up with the Harry Potter books, and now they're like in their early 30s and looking for something that kind of gives them that same sort of vibe. That's what this book is like. It's fun, it's fresh, but it also has this more adult perspective to it. So I gave that book, by the way, 4 stars, and I gave The Talented Mr. Ripley 5 stars. Third book on my list is All the Dangerous Things by Stacey Willingham. Now, All the Dangerous Things is a mystery thriller, and what you find out almost in the opening pages is that there's a woman who's the main protagonist who's lost her child. Her child disappeared a year ago, was just abducted right out of her house. She has no clue of what's happened, and the police have no leads. And throughout the book, you're going to slowly get more and more clues to help you kind of figure out what's happened to this child. There's a mysterious character who runs a kind of true crime podcast that befriends her and starts to help her investigate the details of what's happened to her child. I really thought this as a mystery did a really good job, because I don't normally like mysteries, and I'll tell you the reason why is because I somehow always seem to figure them out really early on in the book, and then I get really bored with the book. And this one, I just did not figure it out until the very end. It was really, really good that way. So I gave this book 4 stars, and I recommend it if you're looking for something fun to read. Number 4 on my list is the best book that I read on this list of 12, and that's The Goldfinch by Donna Tartt. Now, Donna Tartt also wrote The Secret History that I read earlier this year, and The Goldfinch was written 20 years later. It's about 600-700 pages long. It's really, really long. This is the one that kind of kept me from keeping up with my goals here of reading and keeping up with like a book a week, because it took me about 3 weeks to read this one. But I am so glad that I read it. I was almost sad to have it finish. It's kind of like having 3 novels in one, that there's like 3 main parts to this book, and each part has really brilliantly written characters. There's really great action and interest, and it's something like I kept thinking it's like a Charles Dickens epic novel, kind of like any one of his books where you can imagine like, Great Expectations or something, where you get to see this boy kind of go through all these different things. What's at the heart of this novel is a story about a boy who loses his mother during a terrorist attack at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. So while he's there with his mother, there's an attack on the museum, and for the rest of the novel, you're just gonna keep finding out about details that happened in that gallery. You're gonna see what happened with the characters that he ran into at the gallery. It's basically what overshadows everything, including a painting that was there called The Goldfinch. And so it has all sorts of interesting side stories, lots of really, really excellently drawn characters. Donna Tartt is sort of like, when you read her books, it reminds me a lot of like going into a restaurant after you've been eating sort of like fast food a lot, or sort of cheap meals, and you have this really excellent meal and you're thinking, oh my gosh, I forgot that food could taste this good. That's what it was like reading Donna Tartt. I just find what she does is just so brilliant. And, she takes about 10 years to write each novel, which gives you a sense that she probably must be poring over each paragraph in this book for a week or 2 at least. And so because of that, everything seems really finely crafted, and I just can't get over how good her writing is. I'm amazed that she's on our earth right now, that we get to live during the time of Donna Tartt. And it's been about 10 years since The Goldfinch came out, and I think it was 2011. And so I'm hoping that we're going to soon see a new novel from Donna Tartt, and I'll be one of the first people to buy it. And so you can imagine I gave that 5 stars. Number 5 on my list is Trust by Hernan Diaz. And Trust is, again, multiple novels in one book. This one literally, because what happens is you're going to hear about a couple, a wealthy financier type person on Wall Street in the 1920s who makes a lot of money even during the 1929 stock market crash, and his beautiful wife who's multi-talented. Now, the first part of the book, you're going to read a novel about this couple. And so it's a novelized version of this couple, and it's kind of written in a very stilted 1920s style. And then the second part of the book, you're going to read the memoir of the businessman, the financier, who's going to talk about his wife and how he rose and how he did so well. And then in the third part of the book, you're going to see a researcher who helped that businessman write his memoir, but you're going to see she finds the letters of the wife, and therefore we get to hear the voice of the woman who was his wife and was talked about in those other 2 books in the novel. And so ultimately what this is a story about who gets to tell our stories. When something happens and there's multiple people there, everybody's got their own perspective, their own way of telling the story, and I think that you can really get some really interesting insights from the way that you get to see these 3 stories about the same events from a novel, from a memoir, and from actual letters. I gave that one a 5. Number 6 on my list is a book of nonfiction. It's called The Voltage Effect by John List. Now, I got to tell you how I found out about this book. I was at the University of Chicago last September, and I was visiting a professor that I know there. And he took me to a coffee place. And while we were waiting there for the coffee, I think actually this coffee place was in the business or economics building at University of Chicago. And this guy comes in and he's wearing a hoodie. He's like, he's in his 50s, he looks pretty fit. And he stops and talks to us for a little bit. Mainly he talks to my host, and they're chumming along, and then suddenly he says goodbye and goes up into the lift and it disappears. And so my host turns to me and says, that guy is going to be one of the next Nobel Prize winners in economics. And I said, oh, really? And that's kind of a thing to say there, because at the University of Chicago, they have this history of winning Nobel Prizes in economics. In fact, they have a whole little room there that's sort of like a sanctuary to the people who won the Nobel Prize in economics. So it's a big honor when people are whispering about you and saying that you're going to be the next person to get a Nobel Prize. So I had to go look him up when I got back, and that's this book, John List's The Voltage Effect. And John List is in behavioral economics, and he's run a lot of experiments that are called field experiments. These are the kind of things where he can go ahead and manipulate information that people receive in a particular neighborhood, or just tries out different interventions on a very large macro level. And I found a little of this sometimes a bit ethically questionable, because a lot of times it sounds like his research, the participants in the research don't even know they're being studied. That aside, they're fascinating bits of research. And the voltage effect is really about sort of like how he's taken his research ideas and shows how you can take interventions and put them at scale. And the voltage effect itself is referring to the idea that your little intervention that you developed gets enough energy that it gets caught on and it spreads out like wildfire to other places and works really well. Now, he talks about this also in terms of case studies. He worked at Uber, he worked at Lyft, he's been an advisor for President Bush. Lots of really interesting experiences in his life. And so there's a lot of really cool studies in here. And also he's just giving you some basics about economics. And I'm not that well-versed in economics. So I found this book really quite enlightening, and I give it a 5. Number 7 on my list is a personal indulgence, and that's Born Standing Up, A Comic's Life by Steve Martin. Yeah, Steve Martin, the comic, the actor. Now, reading this book was inspired when I saw Jerry Seinfeld interviewing Steve Martin, and Steve Martin was talking about how he had just walked away from being a stand-up comic at the late 1970s, early 1980s, and he had written about it in this memoir. And so I thought, that's really interesting, because I hadn't really thought about this, but in the late 70s, when I was a teenager, my friends and I were really into Steve Martin. He had some albums out that we'd listened to. He was on Saturday Night Live a lot. He was just really funny. He was this wild and crazy guy. He had all these props, this big white suit. And then in the 80s and 90s, he was just making a lot of movies. And I had never really thought about the fact that he had just transitioned from being a stand-up comic to being a movie star. But he'd done that very deliberately. And this book really talks about his rise as a stand-up comic, and then why he left it altogether. And so you get to hear about his origin story, how he starts out at Disneyland selling magic tricks in the magic shop at Disneyland when he's only like 13 or 14 or something. It's amazing he was allowed to work at that young age. He was basically had a very strange childhood, if I were going to judge it at all. I mean, he was really left on his own, and he did a lot of stuff just on his own. Even when he went off to college, he never called his parents because he didn't even know that he was supposed to. And so he didn't have much of an attachment to his parents at that time. But anyway, it's lots of cool anecdotes, tells you how he discovered comedy. He was really just planning to be a magician or an entertainer, and then kind of came across in philosophy absurdism and Dadaism, and that's really what got incorporated into his magic act, and that's kind of explains why he has such strange bits that he had in the 1970s. And also there's lots of great stories, like when he dated Linda Ronstadt, didn't make a move on her, and oh gosh, all sorts of fascinating things here where he's rising up, a lot of other people in the 70s are rising up. So I recommend this book a lot. I gave it a 5. And again, it could be my own personal interest because of my life of back then with Steve Martin. Number 8 on my list is Graham Greene's The Quiet American. Now, this is considered a classic book. I only gave it 4 stars. I read it because my son had to read it in high school this year, and he had told me that it was really good, and it was his English teacher's favorite book. I started to read it. It's about Vietnam, and it's Vietnam in the early 1950s, before the Americans really got involved. And it's really at that point the French who are fighting a communist uprising, because the French are the occupiers of Vietnam at that point. And so you kind of learn a little bit about the French, what their perspectives are, what the Vietnamese are thinking. And then you got this quiet American, this American who shows up, who seems to be quite mysterious. Now, at the very beginning of the book, by the way, he gets murdered. So right away, within the first couple of pages, you're going to discover that this quiet American is murdered. And so it's really like the rest of the novel is to try to explain or help you understand how this guy would have ended up getting murdered. I probably would have liked this book more if I actually liked the characters more. I think that I'm having a problem with Graham Greene's main characters. I don't think I really like them very much. It's happened in my previous 2 Graham Greene novels. I'm hoping that there's a Graham Greene novel out there that has characters that are more likable than this. So even though I found it like a fascinating story, I couldn't really relate to the characters, didn't really care about what was going to happen to them, didn't care that this guy had died. Anyway, that's my take on Graham Greene at this point. Take it for what it's worth. Number 9 on my list is Happy Place, written by Emily Henry. Emily Henry, if you don't know, is a very popular writer right now. She writes this genre of books called romantic comedies, rom-com novels. It's the kind of thing like if it was made into a movie in the 90s when it starred Tom Hanks and Meg Ryan, so it's that kind of novel. In fact, if you haven't really seen these books, I got to tell you about them. You can find them pretty easily on the shelves of your bookstore, because they usually all use the same sort of artwork on the front. They kind of look like these really brightly colored, almost cartoon-looking things. They're all kind of the same genre, and there's several authors who write into it. The other thing I'll just tell you about this genre of rom-coms is that they're very light, and they're very fun, and they're very jokey, and they usually have protagonists that can say really clever things like any romantic comedy. But then they suddenly will have a sex scene that it'll just like, oh my gosh, this is like almost like soft porn. It gets really quite over the top. I know I'm going to sound very prudish here, but you know, it's just something I'm not used to when I'm reading a novel and all of a sudden it goes on for 5 pages of detailed stuff. And so maybe that's part of the appeal of these books. I don't know, but you should just know that that's a thing that comes with these romantic comedies. Anyway, Emily Henry. This is like the 3rd Emily Henry book I've read. I think I enjoyed all of them. They're kind of fun. They're light. They're certainly not any Donna Tartt kind of book. I have to say, though, that Emily Henry is my favorite of these romantic comedy writers. She writes really, really well, and I kind of wonder why she doesn't try dabbling into something more serious, because I think she actually could probably do some really excellent literary fiction if she wanted to. Of course, who am I to give her that advice? She's probably doing very, very well with these novels that she has already. So I'm going to give this a book of 4, even though the genre isn't really the hardiest kind of genre. Because of her good writing, I'm giving her 4 stars. Number 10 on my list is Endgame by Frank Brady. Endgame is Bobby Fischer's remarkable rise and fall from America's brightest prodigy to the edge of madness. Now, Bobby Fischer was this great chess master who beat Boris Spassky in the early 1970s in a very famous chess match that went on for many months in Iceland. And it's when the Soviets were really kind of the height of the Cold War with the Americans, and Bobby Fischer was able to beat this Soviet chess player, and he was an American hero, and he was world famous for being the first person in decades to beat the Soviets in chess. Now you get to see the whole story of how Bobby Fischer rose from the beginnings of his chess career, how he was basically left alone hours on end because his mother was working and his father was absent. And so he went off to chess clubs, and he became quite obsessed with chess at a young age, to the point where, you know, by his 15 or 16, he wants to be the world champion, and he wants to really know everything there is about chess, and just completely is obsessed with it. And then, so it's only in his early 20s that he becomes this world chess champion in Iceland. So you get to see this quick rise, or I guess it's not that quick, it's like 10, 12 years of him just going through all those stuff and having this very strange developmental period. And during that time, he starts to develop paranoia about the Soviets, thinks that the Russian players are cheating all the time. And so after he wins in Iceland, he actually then went for another 10, 15 years, or maybe even 20 years, living like a homeless person. Pretty much just had like a little apartment someplace, had all these millions of dollars that he just lived on, and lived very, very frugally, and didn't play chess. And in the 90s, he played chess again in Yugoslavia. Then the Americans were after him because he wouldn't pay taxes, and he was going against the violations of what the Americans wanted him to do. So anyway, he ends up in Iceland, and that's where he ends up dying in 2006, I think it was. It's a very strange story in the sense that you think this guy was so absolutely brilliant. And you might want to come up with easy labels like, oh, maybe he had autism spectrum disorder, or there was something else sort of really wrong with him, you know, like maybe he has schizophrenia or something. I don't know if any of those explanations really works really well. I think it's more like somebody who just had sort of very traumatic events happen early on where he didn't really have the emotional support that he needed, and chess became that support. And it's the obsession that really kind of makes everything really weird for Bobby Fischer. Anyway, it's an excellent, excellent biography. It's written in such great detail that even if you don't like chess, I think you'd really enjoy the story. I actually do like chess. I've studied it, played it a lot, and so there's lots of it in here that's also appealed to me. I gave that 5 stars. The next book I have on my list is Gabrielle Zevin's Margarettown. Now, I read this book because I had read Tomorrow, Tomorrow, and Tomorrow earlier this year. Really, really liked that book. It's her latest novel, and it's getting a lot of press, a lot of kudos. I think it was Goodreads' #1 book last year. And Margarettown is a novel that she wrote in 2005, so 17 years ago. And it's a strange book. It's basically about a guy who falls in love with a woman named Margaret, and there's lots of other women in her life named Margaret. They all have the same name or some variation of the name Margaret. And the story jumps around from different perspectives to Margaret's perspective in the middle of the book, and to her fetuses in another part of the book, and back to his perspective. And it just kind of jumps around. It's a very experimental type novel. And there were bits in it that I thought were brilliant, but overall, I just didn't feel very satisfied by it, and I had to give it 3 stars. And finally, number 12 is my last book on the list, and it's a fairly short one. It's called So Many Steves, Afternoons with Steve Martin. And yes, it's a follow-up basically to Born Standing Up, the other book that I had read, in which this author, I can't remember his name right now, Adam Gopnik or something, he interviews Steve Martin, and over different Tuesdays or different afternoons with Steve Martin, and they kind of talk more about some of those details of the stories that are in Born Standing Up, talk more about what happened in his movie career. Steve Martin is really quite fascinating because not only did he do the stand-up comedy, he did movies, he wrote some really great novels like Shop Girl, and he also became this very premier banjo player and wrote some musicals with Edie Brickell. And he's also a big art collector, and so he kind of like dabbles in lots of different things, and he kind of gets bored with them, or he feels like he's done enough on that, and then he just sort of gives it up and moves on to something else. So now he's like pushing 80, and he's in that Murders Only in the Building, or Only Murders in the Building, and that's what he's doing right now. So again, I'm just really pretty fascinated with Steve Martin, so that's why I read this one, or got to hear the interviews at least. And so that's my 12th book, and I gave that 4 stars. And those are my 12 books up till the middle of June. So if you stuck with me to this very bitter end here, I really appreciate it. I will give you another update in a few more months. The next book I'm reading, by the way, is Ernest Hemingway's A Farewell to Arms. I'm really enjoying that so far. But who knows what else I'll read between now and the next time you see one of these videos. So thank you so much for watching. If you have any recommendations, please leave them in the comments below if you think there's something that I would like based on the way I described these books. Or if you have any questions or specific recommendations, I'd be glad to talk about them. You can also, by the way, follow me on Goodreads or friend me on Goodreads. I love Goodreads in terms of that's how I get a lot of my ideas for books to read, is to see what my friends and other followers are reading. So anyway, thanks a lot for watching, and if you like this one, be sure you give it a like, and I'll talk to you later. Bye-bye.